Hello everybody, this is Antonio Wolf. A while ago I was asked to eventually make some comment videos about Hegel and the Kantian relation. What does that whole thing have to do with? There's a lot to be said about that, and I will admit I'm not so knowledgeable about what's to be said on that. I've mainly read secondary literature, so I can't say I see anything imminently to Kantian philosophy, which in various places assuredly Hegel is responding to. As usual, taking a walk, and Balboa's way back there. You probably can't see him. He just kind of went around the corner right there. He's taking his sweet time. I was trying to do a recording for a new lecture style video earlier. My battery on my laptop sucks. It only lasts for about like half an hour, so I got like about 10 minutes worth of recording on that. If you ever done recordings on that kind of stuff, it's not as easy as it seems. There's a lot of having to take and retake and splice and dice to make it sound as clean and smooth as professional stuff sounds. It's a lot easier to do rambling blogs like this, vlogs, than to be working on a simple structured video like those. Even when you have stuff to read, by the way, where you don't have to be ad-libbing as you go, it's still very difficult because you have to figure out a flow on how do you want to sound when you're reading things, and what do you want to emphasize with your voice, and all that jazz. So it's not that easy. But anyways, Hegel and Kant. So the most famous thing you've ever heard of, if you've heard about this relation, is obviously Hegel against Kant on the thing in itself. That actually comes up extremely early. In the science of logic, for example, where right in chapter 2, in Being in Itself, Hegel brings up that specific concern, and his basic critique of Kant is, look, the thing in itself doesn't make any sense if you try to remove it from all context. If of course you cannot cognize the in itself if you've gotten rid of all its relations, including its relations to us. There's nothing to be conceived about anything if you remove it from all relations, because that thing isn't even, you can't even say it's related internally to itself, because obviously in order to say anything about it, it has to be relating to it. You have to have known it. And to have known it is to have known it according to how it presents itself to you. So there's quite a bit more logical specificity on that. I'm actually going over what Hegel specifies, and by that I mean I'm saying more than he actually does, because it's that simple. Hegel says Kant's thing in itself is really being in itself, and being in itself is only in being for other. Because to be in itself, something has to be negating a being for other, whereas something which is for other is negating its own being in itself. But since being in itself is defined precisely against and is only intelligible against being for other, the thing in itself, as a form of that, must also be defined against and through its relation to us, its relation to our cognition. So Hegel just gets rid of that distinction and says, well, Kant gets it wrong. He absolutizes being in itself as the in itself, as the thing in itself, but then gets rid of the very thing which makes it intelligible, which is its being for other, which would also be its being for us. I mean, there is something in the phenomenology in the 3rd chapter, I think, Unfortunately Understanding, where Hegel says something somewhat similar. not in that exact logical lingo, but he says something along the lines that if things which appear, that appearance qua appearance, appearance as pure appearance, is not a falsehood. That when that appearance, there is a small section, I mean, not even a small section, it's one sentence. It's a fraction of a sentence in the Miller translation, which has a very stunning translation, which none of the other translators brought out, in which Miller translates what Hegel says as appearance is total show. It is not an appearance, but appearance as such. And that immediately struck me as, holy shit, that's true. That which appears as it appears, and when you're talking about absolute appearance, you're talking about total appearance, fully reveals exactly what is in itself. I mean, that's exactly how the revelation of the in itself even happens. It has to reveal itself through an appearance. You know, one single appearance, you don't know what the in itself is. Two appearances, you're starting to get a bit more. 3 appearances, 4 appearances, 5 appearances, and absolutely then, you know, the infinite amount of variations of appearances which are possible for the thing, which are essential appearances and not just relative appearances, but essential appearances for itself, you know, of what is within it, will reveal exactly what is within it. I mean, you have an apple, or rather, why talk about shit that's not here? You have a flower. Multiple ways that this appears to you. You can dissect a flower and notice, you know, the organs within it. What are you doing? Get over here. He's being lazy. Again. I'm just going to leave him behind, see if he catches up. So you have this. You can cut it, dice it, find out its, look at it under a microscope, see its cells, see how they function. That's one level of appearance of whatever this plant is. I don't know what this flower is. They grow all over the place here. They're really nice. I mean, like they're, you know, look at them. They're pretty. I like them. They're very beautiful when you see them just lining all the fields here. I mean, God, look at this grass. Look at this grass. You can't see the little flowers back there. You can kind of see the speckles. But anyways, whatever this plant is, those things, like, you know, if you just take the flower and you analyze, you know, its chemical compounds and color, you look at its biology at the cellular level, blah, 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 for just the flower, that's only partially an appearance of the plant. And then you look at the stem and you do that at stem. It's another partial appearance of the plant. And then you look at the roots or the leaves, and that's another appearance of the plant. And you put more and more detail to the appearance. And if you just decide that all the appearance that you are interested in is just simply that, the appearance in the parts on the cellular level, you'll probably misunderstand what the plant is. You won't know what the plant in itself is. You'll have all these other things about cells working and all these things, and it won't be enough. And so then you have to look at the interrelation of these cells. You know, what are they doing in relation to each other? You know, how does a stem cell, not to be confused with stem cells, but you know, the cells are the stem, the plant. How does that relate to the flower, the leaves, the roots? And once you start getting that relation, you're talking about the unification of the appearances. And if you can unify all the appearances, that's it. You have the essence. You know, essence, Hegel says in Science of Logic, must appear. And when appearance is fully exhausted, it's because the essence is now fully apparent. So the in itself now has fully appeared as a total show. The essence has revealed itself completely. There is, of course, here some implications about cognition, in which we as cognizers are the ones who can see essence. No one else can. Nothing else can. Animals cannot see essence. Anything that doesn't have the capacity of thought cannot see essences, no matter if they're present for the full appearance of the thing or not. You have to... The plant grows, and for itself, it is apparent to itself, not consciously, but, its existence. Slowly making his way over here. So again, look at these hills. And if I was a cow or some kind of grass-eating animal, I'd be pretty damn happy in these hills. Lots of delicious grass, and just looks pretty comfy. I mean, like, makes you just want to like roll around on this grass, but it's not as comfy as it seems. It's actually pretty rough, but at the same time, when it's hot, and it's quite a bit cooler than just walking around. But where was I? So yeah, things are fully apparent. It's just only a living thing which is has the capacity for thinking and ask questions is going to bother to, one, get all the instruments to be able to see the full appearance, to develop those instruments, and also the capacity to think so that you can conceive the full appearance and then realize its essence. Or rather, conceive its essence, because the essence is already realized in the actual thing. So that's one thing. So that's the relationship of the thing in itself, Hegel and Kant. Whether this actually attacks Kant's thing in itself for itself is questionable. Plenty of people will say, well, no, that's not what Kant is after with the thing in itself. Well, okay. But that's what Hegel thought Kant was after, and that's what Hegel responded to. So, I mean, if you're a Kantian and you love Kant, don't worry, it's not the end of the world. You could probably keep being a Kantian if you want to, because I'm pretty sure you don't care about Hegel's attack of something you don't believe Kant actually said. There's a book where I'm getting some of my information. It's called All or Nothing, Systematicity, Transcendental Arguments in German Idealism, blah, blah, blah. I don't know. The full title, it's called by, Paul W. West or something. Don't quote me on that. I'll link it in the bottom of the description, just in case you're interested. Actually, let me show you something. This flower, beyond being pretty, I mean, I love them. They're really beautiful. They don't have a fragrance, but they have a bulb at the root. And, it's like an onion. But it's not like an onion because that bulb is like this really thick, creamy custard texture. And it tastes like a very, very slightly flavored kind of nut. Like very weak flavor, but it tastes nutty. Tastes kind of like, I don't know, maybe like a really slight pecan or a Brazilian nut, if you ever had one of those. And it's wonderful. And, I wonder if anybody's ever thought of just kind of messing with those and doing some artificial breeding and just growing the share of them to get some big bulbs. Because that would probably make some interesting food. I'd also just eat them raw. I mean, like, chat. They're great. They're awesome. He's still all the way down there. So long as he sees me, he's not going to give a shit. So I'm going to keep walking. So yeah, that was an aside. I don't know what those are called. And boy, they're annoying to try to get to the little bulb, and the bulb is like really, really tiny. It's like something like this big. I mean, you can eat one in a mouthful, and I just like to, every once in a while, just dig one up and just savor the texture as well as the flavor in small little chunky bites. That's an aesthetic road if there ever was one, you know? Reminds me of when I was in Honduras. For those of you who don't know, I'm from Honduras. I'm not from the US. I came to Honduras in about like 20 years ago. Actually 21 years ago now. 2019. And I lived in a dinky little town out in the middle of nowhere. And we had roads like this. And once I went with a cousin of mine on a quest to go get what they called white clay. And there was like, this hill was the hill that we probably went up on was maybe twice as high as this. At an incline like this. Don't know if you can see, it's actually a pretty steep incline. And if you're doing that on a bicycle, like, you know, like carrying bicycles and shit, like buckets, that gets tiresome real quick, especially when you have like, you know, like 2 or 3 hills like that to go up and down. But I don't know, it's a pretty memorable thing, and looking at this kind of stuff just reminds me so much about it. And you know, I can tell you, I didn't enjoy it that day, because boy, we went on a giant runaround looking for white clay, having no idea what white clay looked like. Then, you know, somehow, I don't know how my cousin just kind of realized or remembered that white clay doesn't look white. It's gray. And we just went down to a riverbank and just took a couple buckets to go fix up the good old brick oven. Because we had a big brick oven for baking bread. And we needed clay to fix that. And I don't know why I went on that tangent, but there you go. You know something about me now. Yeah, systematicity, all or nothing. I'll link the book. One of the things that comes up in that book is that it tries to give not the reading that Kant scholars usually give, but rather the author does something neat, which I think is amazing, and I think it's something more people should do with other philosophers, which is he gives the account of Kant that the German idealists were responding to, the Kant that they comprehended rather than the Kant that perhaps Kant intended. I'm getting tired, so let me just rest my arms a little bit here. So one of the things he brings up is trying to make sense of what Kant is doing through what the German idealists think Kant is doing. And one of the things he does is to give a different argument for what the whole thing in itself is doing for Kant, and why you know, the attacks against Kant don't exactly work, but why you would expect that it would have been misunderstood, even if Kant had actually been saying what the German idealists thought he was saying. Their attacks would not exactly have been fatal to Kant. It's a great book. It's supremely autistic, and that is not... For those of you who are gonna go like, oh my god, AW is ableist. Autism is a term of endearment for me. Me and my friends just call everything, you know, anybody who's like obsessively detailed about or obsessive about anything, like, to us is autistic, and we're autistic. People we read are autistic. Anybody who's like passionate about anything tends to be autistic to a certain extent. I mean, it's just like it's a level of concern in details which is just abnormal, but which isn't bad. You know, I like autistic people. They're fun. Hegel's autistic. Schopenhauer's autistic. God, Wittgenstein is super mega autistic. Russell's autistic. Everybody's like, who has like this, oh wow, he made it up here. Holy shit. Look at that. Look at him. Finally decided, he's like, where's my dad? Gotta go find him. Don't want to be left behind. Where was I going? Besides autism, yes, the book is autistic, all or nothing. But it's good autism. It's the best kind of, it's good tism. Gets into a lot of details of the arguments. Goes over the history of Leibniz the Leibnizian Wolffian project, before Kant, and how Kant took over that. About 3 attempts that Kant had, 3 or 2 attempts that he had at a philosophy system prior to his Copernican turn. And then he shows how Kant still kept some of the core of his original attempts and transformed them through the Copernican turn, but he still was interested in the issues that he was interested before. He just thought he had figured out something more. And as a matter of fact, it's funny, it's not funny, but it's very interesting that Kant gets the insight for his turn through Leibniz, in that Leibniz paved the way for the Kantian dualism, and the reason Kant thinks his dualism can work is because Leibniz had a dualism in which he would say, like, he had a phenomenal noumenal divide, without calling it that, where Leibniz thought that everything was monads, and the monads were, independent substances, and the whole harmony, the preordained harmony of the monads experiencing entirely subjective worlds, which had no causal connection whatsoever with each other, but they all seemed to share the same world because they all had a harmonious programming, one could say, by God. And then God was the monad, which harmonized or contained all the other monads, or the monad of monads. And then Leibniz has this whole thing. Okay, well, how are you supposed to make intelligible the natural world and the intelligible world? And Leibniz makes this divide between that. Okay, we're going to have one set of arguments that are going to fall towards what is called the Agrippan trilemma, which is a medieval form of the argument of classical skepticism about justification, regression, explanation, etc. And this follows onwards from probably Sextus Empiricus, which is the only remaining major classical skeptical work we have from sounds Latin, so I assume he's like from Roman times, but he was carrying on like the Greek skeptical project. He was an exponent of someone else. I forget who it was. But anyways, those problems tend to be thought to only affect epistemology, but they also affect ontology. They basically affect everything, you can't escape them. And so Leibniz also realizes this, and so he has an attempt to answer both the epistemological as well as the ontological and semantic forms of the argument, in which what you would call the phenomenal or the relational for Leibniz, that would fall to the Agrippan trilemma. Like, those would be unanswerable. They would just keep regressing infinitely. But then once you shifted to the monadic level, the metaphysical level, you could have a final absolute standpoint which will not regress infinitely and will terminate the whole series of questions, and you'll find you have a definite answer. So in terms of explanation, anything in the phenomenal world that's going to be explained with physics will only be explained with physics, but it will have an infinite regress of explanations because that's just the nature of the natural. But once you wanted to explain physics itself on the metaphysical level, you could have a final point of answer. So Kant takes that up later and transforms it into this comparative turn. And there are reasons for why Kant can talk about how things in themselves cause us to have impressions, perceptions, blah blah, experiences. And at the same time, he can say something like cause is just a category of our mind, and that's because he's using cause in two senses: the cause as the relational cause, and then cause as a metaphysical cause. And those things are not the same. There's a noumenal cause, and then there's a phenomenal cause, and they're not the exact same things. And so there's that whole line of argument about how German idealists are attempting to solve a lot of the issues that arise from this dualism. And as a matter of fact, they radicalize this dualism. For example, Hegel himself, I know for sure, it carries on. It carries on with Hegel. Hegel has this sense in which the phenomena would be where the sense in which you're caught within a concept structure immanently. So say with space just keeps going on and on and on. And every time you want to determine the physical, empirical limit of space, you can't. Because space, by definition, you'll just keep going on. But if you want to determine the intelligible metaphysical limit of space, you can. Space is the self-externality of nature. And the limit of space is its internal dimensions as well as its external limit, which is time. And the limit of time is then space, blah blah blah, and you get this whole repeating structure. And so that's a very interesting thing that in the way that the author there puts it. The German idealists actually take that kind of strategy up from Kant, and that strategy goes on from Kant to the first German idealist, which is hardly recognized, Reinhold. Then it goes on to through a couple other people who critique Reinhold, and then it goes on to Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. And then there's a whole Spinoza controversy about how Spinoza gets infused into Kant, and how Kant himself begins by bashing on Spinoza on his first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason and the second Critique of Pure Reason, the second version, and the later critiques. It's noticeable, like it's amazing. It's noticeable that he goes from just shitting on Spinoza, goes like, oh well, Spinoza, that moron, just didn't understand. And then he goes on in the second edition to say Spinoza is the greatest dogmatist there ever was. The choice is between Kantianism, my philosophy of Kantianism, transcendental idealism, and Spinozism. And this all happens because of Spinoza controversy started by Jacobi with, I think it was his publishing of the deathbed confession of Lessing, confessing that he's a Spinozist, and the whole arguments there about Spinoza being an atheist or not, or blah, blah. So that book is really great. I read about half of it over summer last year, and then I didn't finish it, but I should reread it entirely again because I was only reading it semi-casually, and I can tell you that you cannot read anything, you cannot read absolutely anything in a worthwhile manner just by reading it. Even if it makes sense as you're reading it, by the time you're done, holy shit, you're going to have like no memory about like what arguments in detail were made. Be quiet. Shh. And so, I have to go through that entire book and, be doing what I'm doing with Schelling and what I do with Hegel, and just go line by line, argument by argument, point by point, and, be reconstructing that in my mind, and then, stashing that somewhere so I can, in working through it and writing it and then writing about it and talking about it, you remember things a hell of a lot more, and you understand things a hell of a lot more because you're doing that kind of cognitive work. So I got to do that with that book because I really don't remember many of the details. I mean, literally, I'm talking super vague generalities here that I'm talking about. Another one is the relation to Kant. A lot of people talk about this, that, Hegel's trying to complete Kant somehow. I don't think so. It's a sensible argument to see those problems of Kant keep going in Hegel and then find some resolution. But I don't buy that Hegel is interested at all in completing the Kantian project whatsoever. And all you have to do is read Hegel. I think that if you just read Hegel imminently, you notice like Hegel is not interested whatsoever in the Kantian problems. Um, the Kantian problems come into his views because they are the highest form of the problems as far as Hegel is concerned, to a certain extent. But Hegel has no interest in completing the Kantian project, which is also why Hegel's philosophy is just very different from Kantianism. So neo-Kantian readings of Hegel don't make sense to me. Stuff like he's trying to solve the ontological divide. Not really. Is he trying to solve the epistemological problems? Not really. I mean, he necessarily must solve it. And there's a rabbit. Somewhere in that grass, because I can hear it jumping around. And I saw one bolting through. Oh, I see where it is. I don't have anything to throw like near to see it jump. Oh well. What was I saying? Hegel solves some Kantian problems, like the epistemological problems, the ethical problems, blah blah blah. But it's not to complete Kant. I don't see any real reason to think that Hegel has any interest in completing Kant's project. Hegel has his own project, and Kant is subsumed under that, but it's not the Kantian project. As far as the influences go, the influences are everywhere. I mean, yes, the influence of the Kantian epistemological problems are there, but then so are the influences of the whole skeptical, epistemological, ontological, explanatory, semantic problems. And there's Spinoza as well. I mean, apparently it's with the increasing publishing of the private letters of Hegel with others, there's definite interest in Hegel for Spinoza, and you hear that all the time, by the way. Oh yes, Spinoza is very important for Hegel. If you read the actual works, it sure doesn't look like it. There's not that much Spinoza, although there are certain sections which are very clearly Spinoza. For example, in the Logic of Essence, there's quite a bit of Spinoza there for Hegel. Don't know if you can see this. These clouds are beautiful. Look at that guy just chilling. Awful thing is about these cameras, by the way. I mean, well, you should know this. Like, I don't know where you live as the viewers, but here we get like these beautiful skies so often, which is amazing. I mean, the area where I used to live in, it's technically this should be a desert, but due to the wonders of irrigation, we do quite well. But we have these beautiful, beautiful skies and clouds, and there are colors which cameras cannot capture natively. You have to actually go in and Photoshop to get those colors back. It's so wonderful. Kind of check him if he gets ticks, because there's ticks around here. Where was I going? Influences of Kant on Hegel. Spinoza is more on Hegel's mind at his later stages of life, when you see his correspondence apparently. I was reading about that yesterday from a blog on Hegel. I forget what the blog is called. If I remember, I'll post it down below, because it was interesting. It shows Hegel's correspondence with his contemporaries. James Kreins is another one who goes over this issue, and he thinks that Hegel's main debt to Kant is the transcendental dialectic, and he makes quite a lot of arguments. He has his own reading of Kant, which is a reading about intelligibility rather than epistemology or ontology. It's not semantic, because there is a common semantic reading of Kant as well. So there's the epistemic, ontological, and semantic reading, which you would think is the three possible ones, right? But no, there's a fourth, and the fourth is the intelligible reading, which is also what Hegel does. Hegel's really not about semantics. He's about intelligibility, and the intelligibility reading is also the explanatory reading, that it's an attempt to answer to the question of explanation. And so Kreins has a reading of Kant, which is reading him through the problem of attempting to give reasons for things, as opposed to just giving these abstract arguments of being focused on knowing or things, or what can we mean. Rather, he's trying to give what can we actually give as reasons. And he has that reading of Hegel as well, and he says that reading is tied to the Hegel reading specifically is tied to the transcendental dialectic, where Hegel says that in the transcendental dialectic, Kant has rescued dialectic from the grips of history and revived it, even though he did it only in a formulaic way, whereas Hegel saw the real way the dialectic works. And by the way, Hegel gets the real way the dialectic works probably from Hölderlin. His friend Hölderlin, if you see some of his short notes and essays that he never published in philosophy, Hölderlin was probably the crack thunderbolt insight for Hegel as to what the dialectic was, because there are certain things that Hölderlin says which are just straight up pure dialectic in the Hegelian sense. And so there's that influence. There's the influence of Kantian ethics, in which Hegel thinks that Kantian ethics is the highest form of ethics. It's interesting, and I'm talking here out of my ass, just letting you know. I haven't read much of this. Actually, my friend Hyperion is the one who's been reading the Philosophy of Right a hell of a lot more than I have. I've only read the prefaces. But I've seen some sections of Philosophy of Right because I've been looking up some stuff every once in a while. Kantian ethics is what Hegel thinks ethics in abstract as such is. And you don't see anything else mentioned. As a matter of fact, this is kind of funny. It's interesting too. Richard Winfield has his books on Hegel on, and he goes over the major three for Hegel. The major three for Hegel are Plato, Aristotle, Kant. Those are, according to Winfield, in his estimation and understanding, the three fundamental systems of all philosophy. And these three offer the main fundamental theories for all other valid philosophies. So the valid forms of ethics are virtue ethics, deontology. And I think that's it. I think for ethics, those are it. There is no, Hegel is the third. Hegel is the sublating third, according to Winfield. Stuff like consequentialism is not a valid ethics to Winfield. So, people like Mills and whatnot, and the reason he says so is because I haven't read this in a while because I read it about 2 years ago, and I didn't take very many notes. But Winfield goes on about how the reason these are not valid ethics is because there is no system in which you can derive these ethics from. You can't derive utilitarianism or consequentialism from any systematic philosophy, whereas virtue ethics did come out of a systematic necessity. Deontology did come out of a systematic necessity, but something like consequentialism does not. So all forms of consequentialism are not valid ethics in the Hegelian point of view, and Hegel indeed doesn't look at those things, which is, somewhat interesting. I mean, it's hardly. I don't know that he even talks specifically about virtue ethics either. Although I'm certain that if he does, it must come into the picture in ethical life. in that Hegel does talk about the necessity of habits, the habituation of ethics in ethical life. That you try to align the individual subject with those values, ethical values, which society desires. But anyways, not to ramble any longer, because my mind is blanking out right now. That's a little bit on Hegel and the Kantian relation. I'll have to be rereading that book to All or Nothing to really give you a decent overview as to what this stuff properly is. And I'll just leave you with a nice view of nature. Deus sive natura. This has been Antonio Wolf. See you around.